Public education is the only public service mentioned in the Vermont Constitution, and we spend half of our state resources on it. It's one of the most important things that the state does. And Vermont has one of the most equitable education funding systems in the country. But it hasn't felt that way lately, because there are pockets of inequities that hit some taxpayers in some districts much more than others. But what we've succeeded in doing, where other states are still struggling, is in reducing the disparities between rich and poor communities. Where the child lives matters much less in Vermont than it does in other states. And that came about because of the Brigham case. A family in an under-resourced district sued the state under the Common Benefits Clause of the Vermont Constitution, essentially saying that some students in Vermont were advantaged over other students because of where they live. And the Vermont Supreme Court agreed with them and instructed the legislature to find a more equitable solution. In that decision, the court said, to keep a democracy competitive and thriving, students must be afforded equal access to all that our educational system has to offer. It was really about making sure all kids had access to the same resources. But even though we're doing a better job on that front than most states, what stands out, I think, for most people are the remaining inequities for kids and taxpayers. A lot of people worry that not all kids are getting the resources they need, and at the same time, I think many Vermonters are concerned about high school taxes. So these can seem like sort of dueling problems to solve. But our system is really based on three central principles. So any reforms we undertake should take those principles into consideration. Fairness for students, fairness for taxpayers, and ensuring local control or local responsibility for schools. The main way that Vermont ensures fairness to students is that school taxes are statewide taxes that all go into one big pot that we all share. That means, again, in Vermont, school funding is not dependent on the wealth of the particular community. We're one of only 2 states where that's true, where we have statewide school taxes and all the revenue is pooled and then distributed out across the state. This one big pot, the education fund, and all of the 3 major revenue sources, which include residential school taxes, non-residential property taxes, and consumption taxes like sales tax, the whole sales tax, and then part of the rooms and meals tax, go to fund public education across the state. And the fact that it's a statewide tax is significant for 2 reasons. First, we're all sharing the non-residential property taxes, which we weren't before. It wasn't true before. So it used to be that if you had a ski resort or a lot of second homes in your town, you just kept that revenue local. And so that was a big part of why there was so much disparity between wealthy towns and less wealthy ones. So it was a big step forward in fairness for students that we're all sharing the non-residential piece, and they all have access to the same pot of resources. Before Brigham, some towns had big pots, some towns had small pots. It's helpful, I think, to think about it like the gas tax, right? Just because you buy your gas in Rutland doesn't mean that the tax proceeds stay in Rutland, right? We pool it, and we have a statewide transportation plan for making sure that all our roads are taken care of. But the second reason that it being a statewide tax really matters is that we're really thinking about that residential slice of the pot collectively. We're figuring out how much we need to raise from that slice, and then we're setting tax rates based on the total amount we need statewide. So we're all collectively paying for all Vermont's kids since Act 60 of 1997. No towns are funding their own schools, right? Everyone's drawing on all 3 of those slices. They're using the non-residential and the consumption taxes. And the non-residential slice and the consumption taxes make up the bulk of the money in the ed fund, about 3/4. So rather than thinking that the money that we're raising in our town is just going to our school budget, it's really more accurate to think about it as our town's contribution to that residential slice of the one big pot. The goal of this is that all students have access to the same pot, but residents of each district still decide how much to spend on their schools, and that's where local control comes in, or local responsibility. We're really maintaining local control over school budgets. Local school boards are determining their budgets, and then local voters are voting on them and determining that local spending each year, mostly on town meeting day, although some districts do it a little differently. And unlike other public spending, voters are directly deciding how much to tax themselves each year based on how much they want to spend on schools. That means while we are all paying for all the kids, we're also trusting each community to know best what they need for their kids. And then we add up all the town budgets, and that's the total of what we need to collectively raise for our schools. And these local spending decisions determine the residential tax rates local homeowners pay in each town, right? Here's where the fairness for taxpayers comes in. The idea is that resident taxpayers in any town pay the same rate for the same per pupil spending. The non-residential rate is one fixed rate statewide because those taxpayers are not voting on the budget, so the rate doesn't vary with that choice. And the sales tax is what it is, the state sales tax, and that comes in at the same rate across the state. But because residents get to decide on those school budgets, their rates vary with their decision. So the rates for those residential school taxes are determined each year by per pupil spending in your town based on the budget you approve on town meeting day. Towns with higher per pupil spending have higher tax rates. Towns with lower have lower tax rates. Towns with the same per pupil spending have the same tax rates. It sounds simple, but it wasn't true before 1997, right? Before Act 60, you could have a high tax rate and not much money to spend. And you can see that in this chart, right? It's all over the place. Or you could have a low tax rate and lots of money to spend per pupil. It's just dependent on how much property wealth you have in your town. But since Act 60, there's been a coherent relationship between tax rates and what each town has to spend per pupil. Towns that make the same effort, meaning they have the same tax rate, get the same payments for that education fund per pupil, regardless of how much their residents are contributing. So your budget decision does have tax consequences for your town in that your per pupil spending determines your tax rate, but you're not expected to raise a greater share of your budget if your spending goes up. So in one town, the rate might raise a quarter of their budget, and in another town, it's a third. The share of the budget doesn't matter in Vermont because we calibrate the tax rates based on how much we need that collective residential slice to be. So this has made things much fairer for taxpayers in that way. Another big part of fairness to taxpayers is that we try to have school taxes based on your ability to pay. So resident taxpayers can pay their school taxes either based on their income or their home's property value. For most Vermonters, paying by income is the better deal. But for those at the higher end of the income scale, paying by property tends to be the cheaper option. But regardless of how you pay, the more you spend per pupil, the higher your rate. There are two rates for every town, an income rate and a property rate, and they both go up and down with per pupil spending. And this isn't new. We've been adjusting school taxes based on income for a long time. And that's because income is the best measure we have of your ability to pay. It's much better than the property value of your primary residence because that property value can keep growing even when your income isn't changing. And the Tax Structure Commission a few years ago looked at this and found that at the low end of the income scale, the primary residence wasn't a good predictor because most people owed a lot of money out in their homes through their mortgage, or they were even underwater in some cases, right? So their growing property values didn't reflect their net worth at all. And then at the high end, the value of your primary residence tends to be a relatively small slice of your net worth because you often own multiple properties, not to mention all kinds of other assets, right? So where that leaves us today is this sort of messy hybrid system where we try to make the property tax act more like an income tax, and it's more complicated than it needs to be for all involved. It also benefits high-income Vermonters, who end up paying the smallest share of their income in school taxes. It's less regressive than a straight property tax system would be, but it also means that middle-income Vermonters are paying the most in school taxes, right? They're paying the highest share of their income in school taxes. And I think what a lot of people are recognizing is that the reality is income sensitivity is out of whack, right? It's no longer doing what it was originally intended to do, and low and middle income Vermonters are paying the price on their tax bills. They can face these big jumps in their tax bills because of these quirks, well, not really quirks because they're by design, right? But there are these challenges in the system, what we're calling the three cliffs problem. And what that is that built into the system are these thresholds on income and property values, or primary residence values in particular, that require some low and moderate income people to pay both an income tax and a property tax share on a portion of their home's value. And then these thresholds create these tax cliffs where an extra dollar of income or a property reassessment or reappraisal can have disproportionate tax consequences, right? So the thresholds haven't been raised or adjusted for inflation in years. In fact, the state lowered the property value thresholds in 2018 to capture more taxpayers. And also because incomes and property values keep growing while the thresholds stay fixed, more and more Vermonters have been hitting these cliffs, and they're seeing it on their tax bill, right? So a homeowner who crosses the $47,000 threshold in income can see a school tax increase of 10, 15, 25% or more. A family with a $350,000 home that crosses the $90,000 income threshold can see as much as a 70% jump in taxes in 1 year. So we really need to fix these cliffs so that taxpayers don't see these kind of jumps. And it's really about fixing the property tax side of the system. The income-based system grows with your income and goes down if your income goes down, right? But the property tax is where you really get hit, because it's not necessarily, the value of your primary residence isn't necessarily tied to your income and your ability to pay. But another big problem I think that came into play in the current year is that certain costs hit certain districts differently. We always talk about the 4 factors that affect your town tax rate, and only one of those 4 is under the control of local voters, right, or the school board. So those 4 factors are changes in education spending, changes in enrollment, changes in property values, and the yield set each year by the legislature, which is what determines how much your tax rate generates for each student. We've always known that there are certain costs that hit certain districts differently, and we've long made adjustments to kind of smooth these differences through categorical aid, which we provide for transportation and special education services, and then through pupil weighting for kids in poverty, multilingual kids, grade level, and then we've recently added weights for small schools and sparsity. But this equation kind of shows you how these tools work, right? On the left side, categorical aid is not factored into your education spending, which is a subset of your total budget after this aid and a few other adjustments come out. So you can kind of see that orange hat coming off the top, and those costs don't affect your tax rate. And we've been talking a lot about per pupil spending determining the town tax rate, but this is really how it works, right? On the right side, we're calculating per pupil spending based on education spending divided by the number of pupils. So that's what's left, education spending is what's left after that orange hat comes off, and then it's divided by the number of pupils. But this is where pupil weighting comes in, right? The number of pupils isn't the actual butts and seats, it's weighted pupils, meaning your actual pupils adjusted for all those things that require more resources. So you can see the more pupils you have in these categories, the bigger that denominator is, meaning the lower your per pupil spending and therefore your tax rate. It also means that if you lose or gain actual pupils, it can affect your tax rate even if your spending doesn't change. So that's where changes in enrollment can affect your tax rate. Then there's changes in property values, which can cause an increase in the tax rate. If everybody's property value in the entire state grew at the same rate all the time, there wouldn't be an effect. But it doesn't appreciate the same rate everywhere. So all else being equal, a town whose values increase more than the state average will see a tax rate increase, because the assumption is that that town's contribution to that residential slice should be bigger, right? And then last but not least, there's the yield. Every year, the legislature determines the yield, which is how much a $1 property tax rate and a 2% income rate will generate per pupil. But it's all based on how much we need that residential slice to be. And it varies every year because there are a lot of moving parts. For one, the amount of other revenue coming into the pot might change. The amount of sales tax or the meals and rooms tax, it might be lower or higher than last year. So people often talk about the residential and the non-residential slices as shock absorbers, because they grow to fit whatever the rest of the pot needs to be, right? So if sales tax is coming in lower than expected, both the residential and the non-residential slices would expand to raise what's needed. But the bases also change every year, right? So meaning that how many people are paying by income, do the property values change? Both those bases are moving all the time. So a whole lot of this is out of control of the school board and the voters. But we would argue that local control is still really critical, because community members know best how to spend the money and what to prioritize in their communities. So the job of the state and the purpose of the one big pot is to ensure that we raise all of the money we need as fairly as possible, and to smooth those cost differences across districts, which is an ongoing challenge because those costs change too. So that brings us to the perfect storm of what happened in FY25. The Agency of Ed provided pretty clear analysis of the main cost drivers in FY25. Increases in the cost of healthcare for teachers, other cost increases driven by inflation, the loss of the COVID-era federal ESSER funds, and an increasing demand for mental health services for kids. The result was that almost all districts had increases in spending, and many districts saw substantial tax increases. And a third of budgets were rejected the first time around, compared to just a handful in a normal year. So we can say that Vermont is and has been a leader in equitable education funding, and what we mean by that is we've narrowed the disparity between rich and poor communities. But clearly there are plenty of ways that we can still improve. So here's the key takeaways about what's good about the funding system, right? We strike a balance between state and local control. We're pooling the resources statewide, so all kids have access to that same pot, which was the goal of Brigham, but local school boards and local voters are still determining their local budgets and managing their schools. So we have less disparity from town to town than other states. Another thing that's good about the system is that taxpayers in all towns pay the same rates for the same per pupil spending. And taxpayers can pay either by income or property. Again, most pay by income, that's the better deal, but high income taxpayers are getting a better deal if they pay based on property. And then per pupil spending is adjusted in multiple ways to smooth some of those cost differences across districts, although there's plenty more to do there. So here are the problems that remain with the system. It's regressive at the high end. Again, Vermonters with the highest incomes are paying the smallest share of their income in school taxes. 2, these cliffs that are built into it that cause spikes for certain taxpayers in any given year, sometimes as much as thousands of dollars, right? 3rd, more costs are hitting some districts more harder than others, right? And so we haven't accounted for all the costs that have these differences across district. And so what that also means is that spending cuts won't address these disparities. Some districts will continue to get hit harder than others if we don't solve that underlying problem. And then the 4th remaining problem is that many of the cost drivers that took place in FY25 are going to still apply in FY26, and they're pretty much out of district control. So what can we do? To start with, we need to more fairly account for those costs outside of district control. That might mean putting more costs into that orange hat and not having it affect the residential tax rates. It might mean investing in a better statewide mental health care system so that all districts have access to these systems and don't have to hire their own staff for that. And then the cost would flow through the state rather than just falling on a small subset of school taxpayers, right? We also need to look at the impact of recent changes to how we fund special education services, and we need to look at school consolidation to understand where costs are high or outcomes are stuck. We also need to do something about these taxpayer cliffs. It's not as simple as just adjusting everything for inflation, but we can make changes so that taxpayers don't see these jumps. It's primarily a property tax problem because, again, the growth in property values doesn't always correspond with the homeowner's ability to pay. But we also need to kind of go back to what the goal of income sensitivity was in the first place and whether we're still meeting that goal, because we're clearly we're helping fewer Vermonters with income sensitivity and by a smaller amount, right, than it used to be when it was first instituted, because these thresholds keep putting more and more pressure on low and moderate income taxpayers. So there's a lot we can do to make the tax system simpler and fairer without losing what's equitable about it. And we can ensure that costs are more fairly distributed. They'll take time, these things will take time, but we can do them. We want Vermonters to be able to make good decisions about their schools, and we need to make it easier to do that.